showing up. I know your week is really busy, and so I appreciate it. I have had the opportunity to sit through a lot of craft talks, and so I was really honored to get the opportunity to do this, and I was also really terrified because a lot of craft talks in my experience are boring and unhelpful. And like one of my biggest fears, always, it's a crippling fear, is being boring. So I'm going to try not to do that, hopefully be helpful in the process. I write nonfiction, primarily, lyric nonfiction, but all of the stuff that I write is true. Anyone in here an essayist or nonfiction writer? Oh, good. So yeah, hopefully some helpful things. Possibly some helpful things for the poet and fiction writers as well. What I really wanted to talk about, since I am a PNCA alum, is how I got from being a photo major to writing lyric essays, because hopefully the issues that I encountered and the obstacles I faced could be useful. And so that's how we share what we know, right? So I want to talk a little bit about the macro, how I got from photography to writing, and then micro, and really walk you through how my process played out in a single essay that's in the book. So first of all, what I write, as Jay mentioned, is lyric essays. I have, my first full length came out last May. It's The Skinned Bird, and it is essays, regular essays, flash essays. There are photographs, there are diagrams, there is one essay that the reader is not permitted to read because I have obscured all of the text with images. So not traditional nonfiction. And prior to that, I had a chapbook that came out called #LoveSong. And this is a collage of tweets, Instagram pictures, and found text. The text being found in a box under my bed because it's all from love letters I've been given over the past 25 years or so. So those are the two best examples of what it is that I do now. What I used to do, though, is paint. I started at PNCA right out of high school in 1991, desperate to be a painter. And I had wanted to be a painter for like my whole life. And no one in my family went to college. Even my extended family, a couple of folks did a year or two, but nobody ever graduated. So everyone was desperate for me to go to a regular college and get a regular degree, and if I wanted to major in art, that was fine. But I was so certain that all I wanted to be was an artist, and so why would I go to a regular school when there's an art school right here in town? So I did it. The obstacle that I faced was that my mom was a waitress, my stepdad was a furniture mover, no one went to college, and we had no vocabulary for any kind of high culture. I didn't know anything about art when I came here, except that I wanted to be a painter, and I didn't even know what that meant, but I was going to do it, and I'm really stubborn. And I got here and I was painting, and in the foundation year, there were only 7 majors back then. Walking around this building is mind-blowing. You could be a painter, you could do drawing, sculpture, ceramics, photography, illustration, or graphic design. Those were your options. And so started as a painter, but in the foundation year we did a cycle through all of the sculpture and ceramics areas, and in one of the sculpture sections I made a box. We had to make a box, and the requirements were that it had to open and something had to be inside of it. And my vision for it was ambitious, like everything, and the execution was clunky, but I was sort of hooked on that. And it's very funny to me now, hindsight being 20/20. But this painter in me wanted so badly for an object that was closed, that when open presented a mystery. It just seems so obvious now. But at the time I was like, oh, maybe I want to paint in pictures in boxes. And so I started trying to make some boxes. I needed to do an independent study to do that. Because there was no mixed media at the time. They started that, I think, a year or two after I graduated. But so I did an independent study to make these boxes, and I was making very precious little wooden boxes with very precious little objects inside of them, and feeling just very, very close to my heart about them, and not willing to accept a whole lot of criticism about them, because I didn't understand why it was so important, these things. But they were met mostly with confusion. The 90s were not about pretty precious things, and everyone around me was making loud, sort of emotive and often aggressive art, and these pretty precious little boxes were seen as twee and cute but unimportant, which was frustrating for me. Another sort of chance occurrence was that, so I'm struggling to make these boxes, and they're taking a long time, and they're failing to land, and I'm not a woodworker, I'm not in love with wood, I just want these boxes. But then I saw someone in a writing class, or in a drawing class, using a cigar box for a pencil case. It was the 90s, like, God forbid anyone be so bougie as to buy a pencil case for their pencils. We were using cigar boxes and broken thermoses and old lunch boxes and whatever, but I saw this cigar box and I thought, somewhere out there are some boxes ready-made of the approximate size, and I could just cut out that whole, long making part and get to the filling part. So I went to Rich's cigar shop, which still exists, and started digging through, because of course they had, I was a smoker then. I knew how many empty packs of cigarettes I had. I was like, there's got to be a lot of cigar boxes around, and there were. And so every paycheck I would go and buy a few. And something amazing happened one time in that I found this exact box. It says 25 Fancy Tales, number 3. And when I went back, I found another. And like, these lived in my studio as precious objects because something really important was going to happen with these, and I didn't quite know what yet. But eventually, I came upon the idea of filling it with 25 Fancy Tales, right? These are very painful to read now, they're so earnest. But again, hindsight, so I brought this to my independent study like the grail, like I have finally, and I presented it to Jack Portland, and he went like this. Do I need to read them? What do you, I want you to want to. It was such a weird deflation of like, okay, I understood as an art student, like my art is failing to do what it needs to do, but like I had no idea how to ask the questions to get it there. And so when I made the second Fancy Tales box, I thought, okay, part of the problem is there's too many words. Part of the problem is it's hard to get them out. So this one was a smaller object, easier to get out, fewer pages. I also included some photographs, less words. There was originally some sage leaves and some busted pottery in here as well. And again, he said, well, I don't, how would this work? Would somebody, would it be on the wall? Would it be on a table? Would somebody have to, how would it work? And then he said, maybe talk to the lit teachers about it for advice. And so I went to the lit teacher, who was wonderful, and she said, well, normally, if I were to give feedback on something, it would be in process, so you could revise, but like this is done, so how can I help you? I don't know. I don't know. I didn't know. One of the last ones I made, trying again so hard, was filled much with objects, again, mysterious little images, snippets that I cut out of books. This one says, I got a little drunker, then we left the party and went home. Pages from dictionaries, strange little mysteries. At the very bottom is a snippet that said, it shouldn't be too much longer, she said, lying. I had a show. They were on the wall.
Good job.
Thank you. People sort of opened them and most of the time we're afraid to touch them. You're not supposed to touch art. And I just this morning looked at my thesis from back then, because I typed it on an actual typewriter and have no copy. And my thesis ended up being all text. I installed text all over the city. I put aphorisms on telephone poles and in newspapers at newsstands and on bulletin boards. You know, nobody ever thought to say, maybe you should write, because this is an art school and we were all artists. So I read in my thesis, in the abstract, I said, I'm interested in cataloging or documentational format. Documentational format. As in archaeological material or scientific evidence using labeling or listing, and I plan for the text to be a more common element than images because ideas come to me as words and are recorded as such. I mean, it just feels so obvious now, you know? And I had always written. I wrote in my sketchbooks are full of words. I took art history from Dr. Ritchie, who still teaches art history, and my notes are not full of art history. They're full of all kinds of rambling and sketches of Dr. Ritchie, and that is why I cannot tell you about how modern art interacts with World War I and II, even though I read all of Shock of the New. But I was constantly writing. I was writing terrible poetry. I was writing my thoughts, and I was writing about things that had happened to me, and I didn't think of that as the thing I wanted to do because I was so focused on the fact that I'm going to be an artist, and artists don't write. And it honestly took a very long time. I will say that one of the things that really damaged my art-making practice was, again, coming from a place of very little experience with art, and being exposed here at school to art history. I thought that to be a good artist, you had to do something no one had ever done before. So when I started making the boxes, the wooden boxes with precious objects in them, someone very helpfully pointed out Joseph Cornell to me. And Joseph Cornell, if you aren't familiar, made very precious little wooden boxes that are kind of mysterious and sort of lush. And I was heartbroken. I thought, okay, well, I guess I can't do that. And then when I started installing my text all over the place, halfway through my thesis, somebody said, oh, wow, you should check out Jenny Holzer. If you're not familiar with Jenny Holzer, she makes these amazing installation of aphoristic text in big, huge places. And I thought, well, guess that's that then. Can't do it. Can't just be someone who is derivative of someone else. Like, they've already made the art, and I didn't have enough context to understand how we add to conversations when we make things. And so I left art school and thought I would never be an artist again. And everyone had said all along, you can't possibly have a secure life as an artist, and so I took that to heart and got a job, and 10 years went by in an instant. And I will say during that time I was doing a lot of writing still. There was a brief phase where I kept a knitting blog. I was publishing knitting patterns. I was still being creative. I was creating things in fiber arts. I didn't think of it as art. I considered myself someone who had wanted to be an artist and just wasn't anymore. But then in 2008, my very promised stable job dematerialized one day, and I lost everything. I lost my house and my 401k and my, and I thought, God damn it, everyone is so full of shit, because if I had been making art all this time, I would have art to show for it. And what do I have now? A bunch of spreadsheets that I don't even have access to because they locked up my laptop the day they kicked me out. Like, there is no promise of stability anywhere, and so my God, do what makes you happy with as much time as you can during the day. So I decided to go back to art, but I was going to be, I had had a real job, and I had had a 401k, and I'd had a house, and so I had an expectation of wanting those things back, and so I thought with so much lovely naivete, much like I did in 1991, that I would get a job as a writer, and so I thought, well, I'll go into journalism, because that's a job. I mean, it was 2008, and it was a little more optimistic then, but I mean, just barely. And so I thought, okay, well, like anything else, I'll just take some classes in how to do that and then be that. Turns out to be a little bit tougher than that, but that's what I did. I started taking classes, and the other thing that was constant during all of this time were the things that fascinated me, the scientific that were mentioned in my thesis. So I'd always been interested in the natural world. When I wasn't making art, I was hiking, I was taking pictures of what I was finding when I was hiking. I wanted to know about the geology of the rocks I was seeing. I wanted to be able to identify the birds I saw and heard. Those have always been constants. And when I look through the work that I made while I was at PNCA, I'm drawing lava rocks, and I'm cutting out pictures from natural history, and I'm using star charts and anatomical skeletons and things like that in my work, in my collages, and that never went away. It stayed with me. Those things were just rattling around in my brain pan, waiting for the right outlet. They always have been. And one moral, I guess, if there is one, is that the things that are fascinating to you are going to be the things that are fascinating to anyone else. Because for whatever reason that they fascinate you, that's the hook, right? And the trick, the magic, is to get the hook out into the real world. So another thing that really, hurt me isn't quite the right word, but that limited my output when I left PNCA was that Jack Portland, who was on my thesis committee and who was my independent study mentor, said at one point, I imagine in a way that was meant to encourage me, you have to be an artist. You can't just want to be an artist, because it is hard. And you will face a lot of adversity and obstacles and rejection, and if you just want to be an artist, it's just going to be too hard and you'll give up. You have to. And I got out of school and I had a minimum wage job, and I had to do a lot of stuff that had nothing to do with art. And every single day that I was thinking about rent or the electric bill or the groceries that I had to buy, I thought, you're failing to be an artist right now. You have deprioritized it. And you tell yourself enough times that you're failing to do a thing, and you think, well, I guess I failed at that thing. And I do think that Jack was right in that writing and art are hard. They are hard to prioritize, but that idea of if it isn't the most important thing in every day, it's not really your thing. I think that's wrong. I look back now over 30 years and think I always needed a creative outlet of some kind. I was always interested in the natural world. Those things never went away, even though I had to pay my rent and I had to, I had the other things I had to do. Your fallow periods, even if it's a decade, is still a fallow period, which is in preparation for some kind of harvest, right? I hope. So, so I got into an MFA. I was going to be an environmental journalist, again, with all the same, intense ambition and singular vision. I went to Wyoming, where I could get a dual degree in creative writing and nonfiction and environmental studies, because that would give me some cred as an environmental journalist. And I got a job at public radio, and I was a reporter on natural resources. A couple of stories were even picked up by NPR, but I didn't love it. And it was like my paintings. It was mechanically competent, but not interesting. And it didn't interest me. And when I had nothing else to do, I wasn't sitting down and writing news copy and that ringing in my ear of you have to do it. I'm thinking, well, I'm writing these weird little snippets of lyric essays. I'm not thinking about what my next NPR story is going to be. I'm not so excited for the next congressional session to open up like my colleagues are. So all this reporting information came in, interviewing sources, taking pictures, going on research trips, and what was coming out was weird. And the main difference in my MFA versus my BFA is, first of all, I had a lot more confidence in my own voice, and I was still the same amount of stubborn, but also weird essays weren't as weird as words in boxes were. And so I was encouraged. It was fine. It was fine if I wanted to do that. And I was looking through some of my classmates' notes from then, because I kept them all. Because that's another moral, is KonMari your closet, but hoard everything else. Because I still have the things that I was meaning to collage in art school in a file somewhere, and I can look back and see all that stuff. It's still rolling around, waiting for an outlet. But so my classmates were very encouraging. They were delighted by the science. They were delighted by the strange facts I came up and the ways that I was combining them with sort of poetic and personal narrative. And so they encouraged me. I was still trying, though, to make a job of this, and you can't make a living off lyric flash essays. So I tried for 3 years to write a big book. I had agents and editors interested. I had a lot of funding. I went all over the world researching this book, and it didn't happen. And what happened instead was this book, which is very close to my heart, and maybe some form that other book will happen someday. But I mean, again, if there's another moral, like follow your fascinations, like go down all the rabbit holes. That is where the juicy rabbits are. Your fascinations will lead you to interesting places, and that's where the good writing is. So while I was trying to write that important book, this is going to be about vultures. I could tell you all about vultures all over the world. I was playing around with some of the stuff I had been amassing during my MFA. And that stuff came in the form of Instagram pictures, these flash essays, and just other bits of ephemera. Every time I ever travel, I keep a plastic envelope, and every paper thing I come across that I can take, I put into that envelope. Coasters, menus, trail guides, I just stuff it into the envelope, because later that's going to remind me of something that I'm going to have forgotten. And so I had these envelopes, and I just had all this stuff, and I was commissioned to a writer that I knew who was editing for The Offing, which is a creative journal from LA Review of Books, I think. She really loved all of my photographs of dead birds, and said she wanted me to do something she wanted something more experimental in The Offing, and she wanted me to do something with the dead birds, and we were talking back and forth, and I said they're kind of like dead lovers, and that's when I thought of digging out the old love letters. And so I put this together, and The Offing rejected it. Too weird, too gory, and luckily Diagram was like, we love weird and gory, give it to us. And so it went up online. And around the same time, I found out I was offered a scholarship to the Fine Arts Work Center summer programs. And I was living in New York at the time, and I looked through their classes, and there was a class called Image and Text. And it was a photographer teaching a class on how you could combine photography and text. And I was like, that's the one I want to take. Send me to that. And so I brought her this project in process, and she was like, that's fantastic, go with that. So it eventually became a chapbook. But also she exposed me to all kinds of amazing other stuff. And so I have some of that. First of all, this is her book. And I would like to point out that it comes in a box. And it's called Mostly True, a whole other craft essay I could talk about my relationship to the truth, because memory is very infallible. But each page is a spread with a photograph and text. And I thought, I'm finding my people. Your people are out there. It might take a while to find them, but they are out there. And then, you guys familiar with Anne Carson's Knox?
Yeah.
Right? Like, what I was doing was not weird. I was just asking the wrong people about it, you know? So, all very encouraging, validating. This is Ander Monson's Letter to a Future Lover, and the subtitle is Marginalia, Errata, Secrets, Inscriptions, and Other Ephemera Found in Libraries. This was originally produced in a box. He did it on Kickstarter, a very limited edition of wooden boxes, and when you would open them, they would be full of the pages as individual cards. I was way too broke as a grad student to buy the box, but I got 2 pages. They say Chelsea's copy on them, and when the book came out, I immediately bought it. It's even got a little, like a library, a little checkout card And what I loved then, and what I love still, is the mystery, is the opening, is the discovery, is making an object that is more than it seems, and that, I didn't know it in art school, but I was interested in mediating the experience at that time of looking to become more of an investigation process, more of a discovery process, and I feel the same way about my writing. And so while I write about myself a lot, being an essayist, it is the material I have most at hand. It isn't as interesting to me by itself because I want the reader to learn something new about the world around them too, in addition. I also have Sophie Cowell's book. I just found out about her. I didn't think to ask about performance artists when I didn't even know what a performance artist was when I started at PNCA. But all of her works come with a book that is photography and text, and both are integral. And I didn't want to make a book that was illustrated with pictures because I wanted the text and the imagery and the diagrams to have a stronger relationship to one another, to play off one another, to change the reading experience and to change the looking experience by being in relation to one another.
Question for you. When you were starting to explore all that and see that the photos and text were coming together in an interesting way, were you looking at who was publishing that type of work?
I looked everywhere for it. And it was really hard to find. First of all, how do you Google that? It was hard to find. So one thing I would do is at AWP every year, I'd walk around the tables and ask everybody, are you mixing text and images? And so sometimes what I would get is here's an illustrated book. And what I have since found after taking the class with Joanne Dugan is that more of this is happening in art books. Yeah, and so that's why now I go to Powell's and I look around and I talk to the booksellers there and say, show me those, because I really think that all of this would have been a lot easier had I found the right people to be in conversation with earlier. But I'm not giving up, and I'm gonna keep making these weird books and finding people to make them for me, even if it's hard. So Love Song happened, and actually it was while I was trying to publish a second piece that is photo and text, and nobody wanted it, Rejection After Rejection. I whined about it on Facebook, which turns out to be a good method of getting a publishing deal, because the publisher, Kernpunkt, the publisher had met me before, sent me a private message and said, oh, well, I'll look at it. And I said, well, your catalog is only books, and this is just 10 pages. It's meant to be a chapbook. She said, yeah, we do full lengths. Do you have that? Do you have a full length? And the thing is that many of these essays started out in my thesis, my MFA thesis. And my MFA thesis was not intended to be a book because my thesis advisor was letting me experiment with form. So there were some journalistic pieces, there were some flash fiction pieces. It didn't hang together as one thing. And so over the years, I had tried to submit it to book contests like you're supposed to. I took things in, took things out, added things. But this really felt like the book that was never going to be. I met a lot of fiction writers in my MFA, and almost every single one of them would get up and say, my first book is really my second book, because the first book is in a drawer where it belongs and where it will stay. And so I thought, okay, well, this is my first book. It belongs in a drawer, and that is where it will live and will stay. So when Jessie said, send me this project you're working on, I was like, well, I have a book, but it's weird. And she read it and said, we would love to publish that. And so that is how The Skinned Bird came to be, a very long, circuitous process. So I want to talk about one of the essays in here. And the essay is called Phrenology. And it is, on the pages, there is text, there are floating text boxes, and there are footnotes. And these things play off one another. The floating text boxes are all from one letter that a woman, Fanny Burney, wrote to her sister in 1811. She got one of the first mastectomies. It was done in her living room without anesthetic. And so she wrote a letter to her sister about that process, that experience. And then the footnotes are all borrowed text from a variety of sources. And the thing about this essay, and then the body text is all fragments from my life and my experiences. Much like everything else I've ever done, this started out, the intention was to write a serious essay about women in science. So I went to the library and I started Googling up all the women in science I could find. I wanted to say something about, why are there so few women in science, and what is it that we're doing to make that happen? How are we teaching women about science? I mean, those were the kinds of questions that I had in mind. But then my research practices are such that one way to say it would be all the wrong things fascinate me. So like I was trying to look for example a woman electrical engineer. And instead what I found was a list of all the women who had been electrocuted in the electric chair. And I could have scrolled on by, but I was like, oh my God, seriously? And like the youngest was 17, and here's a letter from her mother to the governor pleading for her life unsuccessfully. Like, printed out, set aside. This is going to be of no use to a serious essay about women in science, but that's the thing I care about. That's the thing that caught my attention. Or I found out about the Harvard computers. Do you know about the Harvard computers? This was a room full of women in Harvard that just sat there all day doing longhand math. They were doing longhand algebraic math to figure out the shape and distance of stars, which now we can do with a quick push of a button, but then it was all of this math. And I could have been fascinated by the biographies, but instead I was printing out pages of this math because I just found it visually fascinating. And I didn't know what to do with that. These stacks of quotes, these stacks of disparate elements, and meanwhile I'm writing fragments about my life because I think, well, a good essay has to have a grounding in personal experience. And I never got around to writing the serious essay part, and deadline was approaching for workshop. So I thought, crap, I just crammed it all together. I picked an arbitrary organizational element for the first draft, which was senses, 5 senses. So there was a sight, a smell, a touch, and a taste. And I just put this stuff where it seemed like it kind of made sense and turned it in. And people said, that's very interesting. It's weird, and we don't have a way in. And they said all the things that are super helpful in workshop. They also said a lot of things that were not helpful in workshop. And another moral, another lesson is you have to learn to see sort of through the feedback that you're given, because it's not all going to apply to you. It's not all going to apply to the work that you're writing, and that's certainly not the fault of the reader. When I teach writing, one of the first things that I tell the incoming cohort is that they need to do everything they can to scrub the word should from their feedback, because the reader doesn't know what the writer should have done or should do. The reader only knows about their experience, right? And so, and what can happen is you get caught up in every single comment, and that's initially what happened with this essay. Every single comment I tried to fix, but every single time I turned it back in, the comments were wildly different. And you will go frantic with trying to fix every single thing. I mean, there is no book. There is no book that appeals to every person at all moments. And so Charles Baxter, a fiction writer, came to Wyoming, and he talked about something he called owl criticism, which we all then used as shorthand, so I'm going to give it to you to use as shorthand. He recounted a situation where a woman in workshop hated a story that had been submitted with just venom. She had nothing. She just couldn't. And finally, like halfway through the conversation, it came out that she hates owls, and there's an owl in it. And so, Charles Baxter is like, do you want an owl in your story? Then you need to let that criticism go, right? Because that's not useful. And a lot of the feedback I got on this essay initially was owl criticism. But this essay went through 3 different workshops. It went through 3 different visiting writers, and they were visiting writers that I had so much. They were in order: Colson Whitehead, Maggie Nelson, and John DeGatta. And so every time they told me something was wrong, like I just fixed the hell out of that, like the second I walked out of the room. But that meant that it went from second person to third person to first person. I took out a lot of the more visual textual elements, the lists of math. I had a list of volcanic eruptions because, again, it was really fascinating to me that we name a lot of volcanoes after women, and it had nothing to do with a serious essay about women in science, but, you know, why? Why is that? And I had a list of the eruptions, and that ended up being used in a later essay, but I replaced the visual elements with this Fanny Burney with the text boxes. I played around with the format. At one point, there was a lot of very strange. I had some things left justified and some things right justified and some things center justified, and all that went away because it was difficult. But this long process of revision, it was rejected 17 times along the way by literary magazines. At the time, and sometimes still, I use submission to literary magazines as a way of not touching something for 6 months, because otherwise I can't be trusted to not touch it. But if I send it off, I have to just wait, and maybe it is in the form it needs to be. They'll say yes, and if not, I have to at least wait to mess with it. Eventually, that essay was picked up by Hayden's Ferry Review, and it ended up being a notable Best American Essay for 2014. And so you just can't tell me that revision is a waste of time because this thing was revised more than anything else. So I think, so I wrote a little card here about the morals. So don't give up on your vision. Even if it takes a long time, it might take a long time. Ira Glass says it took him 10 years to write like a good thing. It took me longer, but I like being at least in that cohort. And pay attention to the things that fascinate you, and put those into your writing as often as possible, because that's what people are going to love. Even if you don't know how it belongs in there, it's going to be the good stuff. It's going to be the juicy rabbits. And I will say that I don't write every day, and that is another thing that for a long time made me feel like an unsuccessful writer, because everyone says you got to write every day, and I mean, what happens if you can't then? Are you not a writer? I think fallow periods are important. For me, the stuff has to rattle around for a while. It doesn't come out fully formed. I still do a lot of drafting, but sometimes you just have to think about things for a bit, and that needs to be okay. And the best thing about the MFA, in my opinion, and I hope for you, is that it's a concentrated time when you can figure out how it is that you get in your own way. I get in my own way by taking these weird little things people say to heart way too much. I get in my way by not wanting to be boring. That's a very, very bad worry for a writer to have. Those are the ways I get in my own way. And that's something that I figured out during those 2 years. And I'm not always successful at sort of thwarting that, but I try. And I guess that's it. I forgot to write a card with like a swoopy ending. So thank you. And if you have any questions, please.